You think corruption is bad now. Wait until you hear about early California. Imagine a place where judges sold verdicts to the highest bidder, where police officers worked for whoever paid the most that week, where land ownership went to whoever bribed the right official, where your entire future could be stolen with one forged document and a handshake in the right office. This wasn't some distant dictatorship. This was California, American soil, during the gold rush. And corruption wasn't just common, it was the entire system. In 1850s California, everything had a price. Court decisions, election results, property titles, police protection, mining claims, business licenses, every single thing. If you had money, you could buy anything. If you didn't, you owned nothing, no matter what the law said. The judge who heard your case, probably paid by your opponent, the sheriff who arrested you, taking money from 3 different people, the land office official who registered deeds, selling the same property to 5 different buyers, the city councilman who awarded contracts, getting a percentage of every deal. This wasn't individual bad behavior. This was the operating system. Corruption thrived because everything happened so fast that no one could build proper institutions before the thieves took over. California went from frontier outpost to massive economy almost overnight. And in that chaos, the people who got there first and grabbed the most didn't build a functioning society. They built a machine designed to steal. And it worked perfectly. For decades, corruption controlled everything: who got rich, who stayed poor, who lived, who died, who owned property, who went to prison. Every outcome was for sale. This is the story of how corruption became California's real government, how it touched every single person, and how it created a society where honesty was punished and theft was rewarded. This is how corruption thrived in early California. When gold was discovered in 1848, California had maybe 15,000 non-native residents. No real government, no established courts, no police force, no land registration system, no banks, no regulations, just wide-open territory. Then the rush started. By 1850, the population exploded to over 90,000. By 1852, over 250,000 people. They came from everywhere: America, Europe, China, Mexico, South America, Australia, all of them chasing gold, all of them arriving in a place with essentially no functioning institutions. And that's when the corruption started. See, when legitimate government doesn't exist, people create their own systems. And the people who got there first created systems that benefited themselves. The early arrivals grabbed the positions of power. They became the judges, even with no legal training. They became sheriffs, even with no law enforcement experience. They became land office officials, even with no understanding of property law. They became city councilmen, even with no interest in public service, and they used those positions to steal everything. There was no oversight, no appeals process, no regulatory framework, no accountability. If a judge made a crooked decision, who would reverse it? If a sheriff extorted money, who would arrest him? If a land official forged documents, who would investigate? Nobody. The federal government was 3,000 miles away. Communication took months. California became a state in 1850, but state institutions were weak, chaotic, and immediately corrupted by the same people who'd grabbed local power. This created perfect conditions for corruption. Every institution that should have provided checks and balances didn't exist or was controlled by the same corrupt network. The courts that should have enforced honest contracts were run by paid judges. The police who should have protected people worked for private interests. The land offices that should have maintained clear property records deliberately created confusion so they could profit from it, and nobody could stop it. If you arrived in California during this period, you entered a world where the rules were simple: money buys everything. Not metaphorically. Literally. Every outcome was for sale. Every official had a price. Every system was designed to extract payment. You couldn't just follow the law and expect fair treatment. The law didn't matter. What mattered was who you paid and how much. This wasn't corruption as an exception to the system. This was corruption as the system itself, and it touched everything: mining claims, property ownership, business contracts, criminal justice, city services, everything ran on bribes, kickbacks, and payoffs. The people who thrived were the ones who understood this fastest. The ones who realized California wasn't operating under American law or democratic principles. It was operating under a simple rule: whoever pays most wins. That's the world people entered. A place that looked like America but functioned like a criminal enterprise, where opportunity existed only for those willing to participate in corruption or rich enough to outbid everyone else. And for decades, this is how California ran. The corruption wasn't a phase that would end when things got more organized. The corruption was the organization. The people who built California's early institutions built them specifically to be corrupt, and they fought viciously to keep it that way. This is the world where corruption thrived. Your daily life in early California meant navigating constant corruption. You wake up in San Francisco, 1853, you're trying to run a small business. Before you even open your door, you're dealing with corrupt systems. The building you rent, the landlord might not actually own it. Property titles in San Francisco were a complete mess. Spanish land grants overlapped. American claims contradicted each other. Squatters claimed rights. Speculators forged documents. The land office was so corrupt that the same plot might have 6 different legal owners. But here's the thing: the landlord who charged you rent had paid the right officials. So legally today, he owns it. Next month, maybe someone else will pay more, get a different document, and you'll be evicted. The law didn't matter. Only who paid officials most recently. You need supplies for your business. You go to the merchant. His prices are triple what they should be. Why? Because he's part of a cartel. The major merchants in San Francisco formed agreements to fix prices. They bribed city officials to keep out competition. They paid harbor officials to delay competitors' shipments. They controlled the entire supply chain through corruption. If you tried to import your own supplies to avoid their prices, the customs inspector would lose your shipment, or suddenly discover you owed massive duties, or claim your goods didn't meet standards. Unless you paid him, then everything would be fine. You need a business license. You go to City Hall. The clerk tells you it costs $50. That's a month's wages for many workers. You pay it. Next week, someone else goes for the same license and pays $10. Why? Because they knew who to bribe. The official fee was whatever the clerk decided to charge. The real fee was whatever you negotiated under the table. A customer doesn't pay you. You take them to court. Seems reasonable, right? You have a contract, you have witnesses, but the other party pays the judge $200. You lose the case. The judge rules your contract was invalid, or your witnesses weren't credible, or some technicality nobody ever heard of. Doesn't matter what the law says. Matters who paid the judge. You can't appeal. The appeals process is even more corrupt and expensive, so you lose your money. Legal theft. Completely legitimate. Now you're struggling. You need a loan. The banker offers you one at 15% monthly interest. That's 180% annually. Usury laws, they existed on paper, but the courts didn't enforce them because judges were paid by the bankers. You need that loan, so you take it, can't repay it. The banker gets a judgment against you from his paid judge. Now he owns your business, your equipment, everything. This was daily life. You couldn't walk down the street without encountering corruption. The police were the worst. They didn't work for the city in any meaningful way. They worked for whoever paid them. If you were a gambler or prostitute or saloon owner, you paid the police monthly. Call it a license or protection or whatever. You paid, they left you alone. You didn't pay, they arrested you. Simple system. If you were a regular citizen who got robbed, the police might help you if you paid them. If you couldn't pay, they weren't interested. Crime solving wasn't their job unless someone made it worth their time. Here's a real example. Sydney Ducks were Australian criminals who operated in San Francisco in the early 1850s. Everyone knew who they were. Everyone knew what they did. They ran protection rackets, committed robberies, burned buildings for insurance scams. The police did nothing. Why? Because the Sydney Ducks paid them. The police were literally on a criminal gang's payroll. This continued until vigilante groups formed because people realized the official law enforcement was completely corrupt. Every single day, you navigated this. Every transaction involved calculating who you needed to bribe. Every problem meant figuring out which official to pay. Every interaction with government meant extra costs that went into someone's pocket. You couldn't just live honestly and expect the system to work. The system was designed not to work unless you paid. This wasn't occasional corruption. This was your daily reality. From morning to night, everything you did involved participating in or being victimized by corruption. And there was no escape because the corruption was total. The entire California economy ran on corruption. Let's start with mining, the thing that brought everyone there. Mining claims were supposed to follow a simple process. You found a spot, you staked it, you registered it, it was yours. Except it didn't work that way. The recorder who registered claims was corrupt. If you found a good claim and someone with more money wanted it, they paid the recorder. Suddenly your registration was incomplete or filed improperly or disputed by a prior claim. The recorder would rule against you, register the claim to the other person and pocket his bribe. You had no recourse. The mining court, also corrupt. The judge was probably paid by the same person who stole your claim. This happened constantly. Miners would work a claim for months, find gold, then discover they didn't actually own it because of some paperwork issue created by corrupt officials. The big mining companies figured this out fast. They paid everyone, the recorders, the judges, the surveyors. They created a system where they could legally steal any claim that proved valuable. Individual miners couldn't compete with that. You might find gold, but keeping it required paying bribes you couldn't afford. Now let's talk about wages. If you worked for someone else, in a mine, on a construction project, in a factory, getting paid fairly was nearly impossible. Employers formed agreements to suppress wages. They bribed officials to ignore labor laws. They created company stores where workers had to buy supplies at inflated prices. They paid workers in scrip, private currency only accepted at company stores. This was debt slavery by another name. You work all month. You get paid in scrip. You buy overpriced goods at the company store. You end the month owing the company money. Now you can't leave. You're trapped. Workers tried to organize. They tried to strike. They tried to demand fair wages. The companies paid the police to break strikes. They paid judges to rule strikes illegal. They paid city councils to pass anti-union ordinances. In 1850s San Francisco, companies literally hired thugs to beat up labor organizers. The police watched. Sometimes they helped, because the companies paid them more than the workers could. Let's talk about business licenses and regulations. These existed on paper. In reality, they were just corruption mechanisms. Want to open a saloon? You need a license. The official fee might be $50, but you also need to pay the licensing clerk a personal fee, and the police captain who controls the district, and probably a city councilman who could make problems for you. Total actual cost, maybe $200, none of it official, all of it necessary. And next year the prices might change. New officials, new bribes, different amounts. Large businesses handled this systematically. They built bribery into their budgets. They knew which officials to pay and how much. They maintained corrupt relationships. Small businesses struggled. You couldn't always afford the bribes. You couldn't always figure out the system fast enough. This created monopolies. The big players who could afford systematic corruption drove out small competitors who couldn't. Banking was completely corrupt. Banks had no real oversight. They could charge whatever interest rates they wanted. They could foreclose on whatever timeline they chose. They could change terms whenever they felt like it, and they owned the courts. If you disputed a bank's actions, you lost. The judge was on the bank's payroll. Here's how it worked. You borrow money. The bank changes the terms. You can't repay under the new terms. The bank forecloses. Now they own your property and you owe them money. You go to court. The judge rules for the bank. Legal theft. Completely systematic. The land business was even worse. Land speculators bribed land office officials to forge documents. They created fake Spanish land grants. They paid surveyors to draw boundaries that included other people's property. They bribed judges to rule in their favor when disputes arose. Families who'd lived on land for years would suddenly discover they didn't own it because a speculator had paid for a document that superseded their claim. This happened across California. Millions of acres changed hands through corruption, not legitimate transactions. And the victims had no recourse because the entire legal system was corrupted by the same speculators. The California economy didn't run on free enterprise or fair competition. It ran on who could pay the most bribes. That was the fundamental economic principle. Work hard. Didn't matter if someone could pay to take what you earned. Follow the rules. Didn't matter if officials rewrote the rules for money. Build a business. Didn't matter if bigger players could bribe you out of existence. Money determined everything. But not money earned honestly. Money used to corrupt the system. Even disease and death became opportunities for corruption. San Francisco in the 1850s was a death trap. Cholera, typhoid, dysentery, smallpox, poor sanitation, contaminated water, disease killed thousands, and the officials who should have protected public health were corrupt. The city health inspector, paid by property owners to ignore violations, buildings with no sewage systems, businesses dumping waste in the streets. Contaminated wells. The inspector saw everything, reported nothing, because he was paid not to. Landlords who owned tenements crammed people into buildings with no ventilation, no clean water, no waste disposal, perfect conditions for disease. The health inspector knew. The city council knew. Nobody did anything because the landlords paid them. Thousands of people died from preventable diseases because corrupt officials prioritized bribes over public health. Hospitals were corrupt too. Many hospitals charged different prices based on who you were and who you knew. Same treatment, different costs. If you had connections or paid the right people, you got better care. If you didn't, you got minimal attention, if they admitted you at all. Some hospitals were investment schemes. Doctors and administrators inflated costs, claimed patients needed treatments they didn't need, billed the city for patients who didn't exist, pocketed the difference. The city officials who oversaw hospital funding were in on it. They approved fraudulent bills. They looked the other way. They got kickbacks. Medicine itself was corrupt. There were almost no regulations on who could practice medicine. Anyone could claim to be a doctor. No licensing, no verification, no oversight. Con artists set up practices, sold fake cures, performed surgeries they had no training for, killed people. The officials who should have regulated this paid to ignore it. Real doctors tried to establish standards. They tried to create medical boards. They tried to get laws passed requiring actual qualifications. Quacks bribed legislators to vote down those laws, bribed officials to ignore complaints, bribed newspapers to print testimonials. People died from fake treatments, from incompetent surgeries, from fraudulent medicine. And nobody stopped it because the corruption protected the fraudsters. Let's talk about death itself. Undertakers were corrupt. They charged grieving families whatever they wanted. They sold cheap coffins as expensive ones. They bribed city officials to require permits for burials, then charged people for those permits. Cemeteries were corrupt. They sold the same plot to multiple families. They buried people in mass graves but charged for individual plots. They paid officials to overlook violations of burial laws. Even the coroner was corrupt. Suspicious deaths. The coroner could rule them accidents for a price. Murders became suicides. Workplace deaths became natural causes. Evidence disappeared. If a powerful person killed someone, the coroner could make it go away, just required the right payment. Insurance fraud was massive. People took out life insurance policies on others. Then those people mysteriously died. The coroner ruled it natural. The insurance paid out. Everyone involved got a cut except the dead person. This was common enough that insurance companies started investigating claims themselves because they couldn't trust official death certificates. Public health infrastructure didn't exist because building it didn't profit anyone. Clean water systems cost money. Nobody wanted to pay for them. Officials who could have required them were paid by property owners to drop the issue. Sewage systems, same thing. The cost was public, but the bribes were private. So diseases that could have been prevented killed thousands. And the officials who could have saved lives chose corruption instead. This is how corruption killed people, not metaphorically, literally. Corrupt health inspectors created conditions for disease. Corrupt officials blocked public health measures. Corrupt doctors provided fake treatments. Corrupt coroners covered up deaths. And thousands died who didn't have to, because corruption touched even this, even disease, even death. There was no aspect of life corrupt enough, no human suffering profitable enough, that corruption wouldn't exploit it. The justice system was completely for sale. Let's be clear about this. In early California, you could buy verdicts openly. Everyone knew it. Everyone participated in it. Judges set prices. Complicated case. $500, simple case. $200, murder trial. $1,000 or more. You paid the judge. You won. That simple. This wasn't secret. This wasn't occasional. This was standard operating procedure. Here's how a typical case worked. Someone steals from you. You know who did it. You have witnesses. You go to court. The thief pays the judge $400. You can't afford that much. The judge rules for the thief. Your witnesses aren't credible. The evidence isn't sufficient. Case dismissed. You just got legally robbed twice. Once by the thief. Once by the judge. No appeal. No recourse. No justice. Now imagine you're accused of a crime you didn't commit. Maybe someone wants your land. Maybe you saw something you shouldn't have. Maybe someone just doesn't like you. They pay the judge. You're convicted. You go to prison or you hang. Your innocence doesn't matter. Evidence doesn't matter. Only who paid the judge. This happened constantly. Juries were corrupt too. You could bribe jury members. You could pay jury commissioners to select sympathetic jurors. You could intimidate jurors with threats. Rich defendants never got convicted. They paid everyone. The judge, the jury, the prosecutor. Sometimes even their own lawyer worked harder when paid extra under the table. Poor defendants always got convicted. They couldn't pay anyone. The system treated them like they were guilty before trial started. The police were worse than criminals. In San Francisco, police officers worked for private interests more than the city. They provided protection to businesses, meaning they ignored crimes against businesses that paid them and harassed businesses that did. They arrested people on false charges to extort money. Pay us, we drop the charges. Don't pay, we make sure you're convicted. They ran protection rackets. Gambling dens, brothels, saloons all paid the police monthly fees. The police made more from bribes than from salaries. They worked with criminal gangs. The Sydney Ducks in San Francisco paid police to ignore their crimes. The police literally took money to let criminals operate freely. Sometimes police committed the crimes themselves. Robbery, extortion, assault. They had badges, so who would arrest them? Prisons were corrupt. Guards smuggled in goods for prisoners who could pay. Prisoners with money got better cells, better food, special privileges. Prisoners without money got nothing. Prison sentences could be shortened with bribes. Pay the right official, your sentence got reduced, or commuted, or you escaped and nobody pursued you. Rich criminals rarely served full sentences. Poor criminals served every day. This created a system where punishment depended on wealth, not crime. Vigilante justice emerged because people realized the official system was hopeless. In San Francisco in 1851 and 1856, vigilance committees formed. They arrested criminals, held trials, hanged people. This wasn't good. Mob justice killed innocent people. But it happened because the legitimate justice system was so corrupt that people saw no alternative. Think about that. People formed mobs and started hanging people because that seemed more fair than the courts. That's how corrupt the official system was. Lawyers were corrupt too. They bribed judges on behalf of clients. They split fees with judges. They paid witnesses to lie. They suppressed evidence. The entire legal profession was built on corruption. Here's the thing, justice wasn't blind. Justice was for sale. If you had money, you could commit any crime and get away with it. If you were poor, you could be convicted of anything. The system didn't try to find truth or provide fairness. The system existed to extract money from everyone involved. The only question was who paid more. That determined innocence and guilt. That determined freedom and prison. That determined life and death. Corruption didn't just influence the justice system. Corruption was the justice system, and everyone knew it. Corruption targeted the most vulnerable the hardest. Let's start with immigrant Chinese workers. They built California. They mined gold. They built railroads. They worked farms. They did the hardest labor for the lowest wages, and they faced systematic corruption at every level. Federal law restricted Chinese immigration, but corrupt officials sold illegal entry permits. Chinese immigrants paid enormous fees to get into California. The officials pocketed the money. The immigrants got no legal protections. Because they entered illegally through corrupt officials, they couldn't complain about abuse. They had no legal standing. They were completely vulnerable. Labor contractors exploited this. They brought in Chinese workers, promised them wages, then paid them almost nothing. The workers couldn't sue. Courts wouldn't hear cases from illegal immigrants who were only illegal because corrupt officials sold them fake papers. Police extorted Chinese communities. Monthly payments for protection. Actually just extortion. Pay us or we arrest you. On what charges didn't matter. Being Chinese was enough. If Chinese workers were robbed or assaulted, police didn't investigate, unless the community paid them. Then they'd go through the motions, rarely actually solve anything. Landlords charged Chinese tenants triple what they charged white tenants. Why? Because Chinese tenants couldn't complain to housing authorities, who were corrupt and anti-Chinese anyway. The entire system extracted money from Chinese immigrants at every step. Entry fees, labor exploitation, police extortion, housing price gouging, legal exclusion, and it was all corruption. Officials taking bribes, contractors stealing wages, police running protection rackets. Mexican Californians faced similar corruption. After the Mexican-American War, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo supposedly protected Mexican land rights. Didn't matter. American speculators bribed land office officials to discover errors in Mexican grants, or to create new American claims that superseded Mexican ones. Families who'd owned land for generations suddenly found themselves dispossessed. Corrupt officials declared their titles invalid. Corrupt judges ruled against them. Corrupt speculators took their land. Mexican Californians couldn't get fair hearings. They couldn't afford the bribes that Americans could. They spoke Spanish in English-language courts. They had no political power, so they lost everything. Women faced different but equally systematic corruption. If you were a woman trying to operate a business, you dealt with constant corruption. Licensing officials charged you more. Police demanded higher protection payments. Inspectors found more violations. Why? Because they could. You had less legal recourse, less political power, less ability to fight back. If you were a prostitute, and many women were because options were limited, you faced total corruption. The police who arrested you for prostitution were the same police who took monthly payments to allow prostitution. They'd arrest you, take your money, let you go, then come back next month for more. You paid the police. You paid the madame, you paid the doctor, you paid the landlord, everyone took a cut. You kept almost nothing. And if you tried to leave, they'd arrest you for unpaid debts. The courts would side with whoever you owed money to. You were trapped. Children had no protection at all. Child labor was common. Mines, factories, farms. Children worked in dangerous conditions for minimal pay. Officials who should have enforced child labor laws were bribed to ignore violations. Factory owners paid them. Mine operators paid them. So children kept working. Children orphaned by disease or violence ended up in institutions that were corrupt. Officials embezzled money meant for orphan care. Children got minimal food, minimal education, harsh treatment. Some orphanages were essentially labor farms. They hired children out to work and kept their wages. Nobody investigated because the officials who should investigate were paid off. Corruption exploited vulnerability. If you were Chinese, Mexican, female, a child, an immigrant, poor, without connections, you were a target. The corrupt system extracted everything it could from you and gave you nothing in return. No protection, no justice, no fairness, just exploitation at every turn. And the people running the system built it that way intentionally. They created legal structures that excluded vulnerable populations. They created economic systems that trapped them. They created corruption networks that profited from their suffering. This wasn't accidental. This was designed. The absolute worst period was probably 1851–1856 in San Francisco. This is when corruption reached peak organization. Political machines formed. The most notorious was led by David Broderick, who essentially controlled San Francisco politics through systematic corruption for years. Here's how it worked. Broderick's machine rigged elections. They paid voters. They intimidated voters. They stuffed ballot boxes. They threw out votes for opponents. They counted votes fraudulently. Once they controlled elections, they controlled government. They installed judges who followed orders. They hired police who worked for the machine. They appointed officials who kicked back portions of their earnings. Every city contract went through the machine. Construction projects, supply purchases, service contracts, everything. The machine took a percentage of every dollar spent. They sold judgeships, literally. Pay Broderick's machine enough money, become a judge, no qualifications needed. They sold police positions, pay enough, get a badge, collect bribes. They controlled gambling, prostitution, saloons. Everything paid the machine. This was government as organized crime, and it was completely open. Everyone knew Broderick controlled everything. Newspapers wrote about it. Citizens complained about it. Didn't matter. The machine had the power. Opposition candidates got intimidated. Opposition newspapers got threatened. People who fought back too hard got killed. Yes, political murders, bodies in the bay, convenient accidents. This is why the vigilance committees formed. In 1851, the first Vigilance Committee hanged several criminals and drove the Sydney Ducks out of San Francisco. Why? Because the police wouldn't do it. The police were paid by the criminals. In 1856, a larger Vigilance Committee formed after a political assassination. They took over the city. They arrested corrupt officials. They hanged some. They exiled others. For a few months, the vigilantes ran San Francisco because they couldn't trust the elected government. This was mob rule. This was extra-legal violence. This was dangerous. But it happened because corruption had become so total that people saw no legal remedy. During this period, you couldn't trust anything official. Every institution was compromised. Every official was for sale. Every decision was corrupt. If you were wealthy and connected to the machine, you could do anything. Literally anything. Murder, theft, fraud. The machine protected you. If you opposed the machine, you risked everything. Your business, your property, your life. This was urban corruption at its most systematic, but it wasn't just San Francisco. Sacramento had similar machines. Stockton. Smaller cities had smaller versions. Across California, political machines built on corruption controlled local governments. And they stayed in power for years. Because once corruption becomes systematic, it's self-reinforcing. Corrupt officials protect each other. They punish reformers. They rig the system to maintain power. This darkest period showed what corruption looks like when it becomes the actual government. Not officials being corrupt. The corruption itself being the government. So what changed? Why doesn't corruption control everything now like it did then? A few things happened. First, institutions matured. As California grew, professional systems slowly replaced corrupt improvised ones. Not quickly, not easily, but eventually. Real courts with appeals processes made it harder for individual judges to sell verdicts. Professional police forces with oversight made it harder for officers to openly work for criminals. Established land offices with proper records made it harder to forge documents. These changes took decades. Second, reformers fought back. Some died for it. Some were exiled. But gradually, reform movements built enough power to challenge corruption. The vigilance committees, despite their problems, showed that ordinary people wouldn't tolerate unlimited corruption. That forced some changes. Third, federal oversight increased. When California was remote and communications were slow, federal authorities couldn't control corruption. As transportation and communication improved, federal law had more presence. Fourth, journalism exposed corruption. Newspapers documented bribes. They named corrupt officials. They created public pressure. Not all newspapers, some were corrupt too, but enough honest journalism existed to make completely open corruption harder to sustain. Fifth, economic development created legitimate institutions. Banks that wanted to operate nationally couldn't be completely corrupt. Railroad companies needed stable legal systems. Larger businesses required predictable rules. This slowly created pressure for less corruption. But let's be honest, corruption didn't end. It changed forms. We still have corruption, but it's more subtle now. Campaign contributions instead of direct bribes. Regulatory capture instead of paid judges. Legal loopholes instead of forged documents. Modern corruption is sophisticated. It operates through lawyers and lobbyists and PACs and complex financial structures. The difference is this. In early California, corruption was open, obvious, and total. You paid the judge directly. The police worked for criminals openly. Officials stole without hiding it. Now, corruption has to hide. It has to use legal mechanisms. It has to maintain appearances. That's progress, I guess. But the fundamental dynamic remains. Money still influences outcomes. Wealth still provides advantages. Power still protects power. We just pretend better now. The institutions that eventually developed in California didn't eliminate corruption. They just made it more complicated. But yes, thank God you're not living in 1850s California where every single official openly demanded bribes. Here's what you need to understand about corruption in early California. It wasn't individual bad people making bad choices. It was a system built on corruption from the ground up. Every institution, every official, every transaction. The people who arrived first and grabbed power didn't build a functioning society. They built a machine designed to extract money from everyone else. And it worked because everything happened so fast that legitimate institutions couldn't develop before corrupt ones took control. Once corruption became systematic, it fed itself. Corrupt officials protected each other. They rigged elections to stay in power. They used their positions to get rich. They punished anyone who threatened the system. This went on for decades. Thousands of people lost everything to corruption, lost property, lost livelihoods, lost lives, not because they were unlucky. Because the system was designed to take from them. The courts didn't provide justice. The police didn't provide safety. The government didn't provide services. Every institution existed primarily to enrich the people running it. This is how corruption thrived, through speed, through chaos, through the absence of accountability, through the concentration of power in the hands of people who wanted to steal. And once established, corruption lasted because it's self-protecting. Yes, things eventually got better, slowly, incompletely, after decades of suffering. But for the people living through those gold rush years, corruption was their government, their economy, their justice system, their daily reality. Everything they touched was corrupt. Everything. That was early California.